So I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll jump on her boot tails there, and I'll learn from her, which I did rapidly, about the whys and wherefores. Now, I was a maverick, as they've described me. I didn't know what the right thing to say on radio and the wrong thing to say on radio was in the context of commercial radio, or the standard terrestrial radios that are out there. So very quickly into the program, the development of the program, Marie was pulling me back on stuff, and so was the station manager. Now, I would put everything by them and say, look, this is the next program, this is the next show, this is what we're going to do. Everything was fully planned out and itemized, and everybody knew what was what. So then I brought in you, because I thought, well, let's get something completely different in terms of broadcasting about finance. And I found the conversation, I think I'd met you and Harry prior to that, or maybe I hadn't, I don't know. Maybe I just called you on, I think I called you on spec, didn't I? I hadn't met you at that stage, Finn.
You called me on spec. I think we'd met once for a cup of coffee for a half hour, 3/4 of an hour, thereabouts. Yeah, okay. And so I did call you on spec at the time for the radio station. I thought, well, look, I think we were stuck at the time for somebody. And not to say that, you were sort of like the last thing, the last gasp, because I was actually quite happy to have you there, because I've just found what you had said interesting. I didn't necessarily agree with it, again, but I just found it very interesting. It was food for thought, and it was stuff I hadn't heard before. So I was inclined to listen to it because I'd studied a little bit of contract law. I didn't know it very well, but I thought, well, here's somebody that knows. I know you knew that. I knew then that you knew contract law better than I did. So I didn't want to start talking about contract law and find that you knew something more than I did. So I'd rather have a guest on that knew something better than I did, and I'd ask them, and then I'd learn something. So that was the context which I was asking you on the program, along with some other stuff. So we did the program, and I found that my co-host had been quite abrasive towards you. Okay, in the context that the first question I'd asked you, in a friendly manner, I must say, I was asking you as a friend, in a friendly manner. She found it quite an obtrusive. She found you quite obtuse in the way you answered the question. And the question was, I think, if I recall correctly, who are you? Yes.
And you said, I am me, myself.
Yeah.
And she just could not...
It didn't compute.
It didn't compute. It didn't compute with me either. But I thought, no, just listen now. Let's see what he has to say. Let him elaborate and explain and expand, and then we can get into it and question him further. But her shutters came up straight away. And the whole interview then was kind of muted a little bit.
I think what happened, would it be fair to say, she was looking for a legal title, and she was surprised and shocked that I didn't just hand one over.
Absolutely.
But she didn't realise that that's what she was looking for.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, maybe she did, because I found out afterwards that she also had some legal training as well.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, so as I found out, a lot of the radio show hosts out there on the normal radio stations, inverted commas, they have had some legal training.
If not all of them, yeah.
If
Very
not all
few,
of them.
From my research, haven't had legal training.
Yeah, exactly. And so then I think what happened then was, my understanding would be that Marie wasn't happy with the thing, because she said to me afterwards she wasn't happy, and she never in her life had experienced such an unprofessional interview. And I was just laughing. I just thought, well, it's different. And the reaction we got from the listeners out there was, what was that about? Who was that guy? What was all that about? Can we have him back again? It was a very positive. And the station manager was like, what? Because they never get comments. They never get people emailing and writing into them and expressing an opinion about something. In this radio show context anyway, or in the radio station. So he was very surprised that there was such a reaction. That was fine. So we moved on from there. Marie certainly was not happy. And but like me, I was just, happy-go-lucky with it. I thought, well, it was just a show, for God's sake. It was different. There was a good reaction. And I told her afterwards there was a good reaction to it. But that sort of went over her head, because she wasn't happy with the fact that you handled her in the way you handled her.
Right.
If you can call it that. So, so then... I think Marie was off for a week or so, and I had Harry in then. Harry came on the show. And he was just relaxed. You know, Harry, he's shooting the breeze.
Yeah.
And I like to have things pre-rehearsed and pre-planned. So myself and Harry went into the canteen an hour before the radio show. And I sat down, we had a cup of coffee. So everything that Harry said on the radio show, I was expecting him to say, because we'd gone over it once or twice, and I kept asking him the same questions. So he was very comfortable, as he is, you know, Harry, shooting the breeze. I mean, it was a nice, gentle thing. It was a nice, gentle interview, and we came away. And again, the phones were hopping. They were hopping. You know, who was that guy? What was that all about? Can we have some more? And those were the actual comments we got. Can we have some more of this stuff? This is unique. This is different. And, you know, this stuff needs to be said. So Marie came back off her break and more or less told me, I think, round about then, that she wasn't having anything more to do with the radio show. Thanks very much for your time, blah, 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 blah. Now, we parted as friends. But there was certainly an atmosphere that I could detect. I don't think she wanted to work with me anymore because of the direction I was going in.
Was she fearful of the actual information, if you will, the very idea that what she perceived the world to be may have been completely inverted?
I don't honestly know, Vin. You see, she didn't have an open. She told me over the phone, you see, that she was now basically handing in her resignation, and she felt I was confident enough to run with the show anyway, which was nice, you know. And to be honest with you, Vin, I was happy she did.
Okay.
Now, I never got into the whys and wherefores or the fear, but I suspect what you're saying might be correct. That she realised there was something else out there, but she didn't want to be a part of it because it wouldn't lend herself to building it furthering her career in broadcasting with a big station like RTE or the BBC or whatever it might be. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Yeah. So, but I knew straight away that me broadcasting, I found the whole idea very interesting anyway, and my confidence grew over the weeks and months that I was working with Marie. And so then when you offered me, well, I'll tell you what, we'll finish the story off first because it's I think this is a very good point now we're going to get to. We had, for the very final, and I didn't realize at the time it was going to be the final radio interview I did, but the very last interview I did on Dublin City FM was with a man called Dave. At this stage, David Gagan, a friend of mine, had come on board because I like to co-present shows, because if you're not there as a presenter or a host, then your co-host can be there in your absence. So if you're working together on something, you never really miss that much if you're not around. So I had Dave on board then, and he was working with me. And again, he wasn't a brilliant co-host when he started, but I tell you what, he learned the ropes pretty quick. Mm-hmm. Vin, can we take a break for a second, Vin? I mean, literally a second. I've done it.
Go.
I did it, yeah. It's done. Okay. Right, sorry, Vin. We'll go back again. You can continue if you want.
Let me just make a note there. Hold on.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay. So at that stage, I was working with Dave Gagan, hosting the show, and the very final show that we had, which at the time I didn't know it was the final show, was with a man called Dave, or David, and he is what you call a taxi driver. I don't know if that's the right word, but he drives a car around and he picks people up and he charges them a fare for it and he drops them off to wherever they want to go. And I like David. He's a really, really good, solid man, genuine, honest, hard-working, hard-grafting man.
Lovely man.
Honest as the day is on. Yeah. Really lovely man. And he came along to do the show with me, and I think Rory, a friend of both of ours, was there as well. Mm-hmm. And Rory does a lot of research. Rory is a vociferous researcher in different materials and so on and so forth. So I think Rory was giving Dave a bit of a dig out. They were helping one another. And Rory asked me if I'd interview Dave because he had a unique story. And I loved the story. I just thought it was so brilliant. So Dave is, we call it a taxi driver, so everybody has a sort of clear understanding. But Dave would probably call him something else. So Dave had gone and decided to become a self-regulated taxi driver. And he had taken the steps, or was taking the steps at the time. And basically what that meant was that he wasn't going to be working with the taxi regulator's office anymore. He wasn't going to be paying them fees or fines or charges or costs. And he wasn't going to be working under the guise of the Minister of Transport. So I found this an intriguing story, and he'd actually gone forward on this basis, and he started doing this. Because he had researched what the Minister of Transport was up to, what the taxi regulator's office was all about, and also the office that regulates the meters. And he decided, based upon his own research, that he didn't want to participate in this anymore because he felt that it was basically doing him out of a living. He felt it was unfair, and he also realised then, under the law as well, contract law, that he didn't actually have to capitulate to these requests for money and demands for money and, you know, the charges they put on taxis to regulate them in terms of their meters and their, you know, whatever else they do, the charges and all that. So he basically was struggling to make a living from plying his trade. And he realized, you know, recently that the taxi he had bought and put time and money and energy and effort and most of his life into was virtually worthless. The business he'd built up, very much like my business, was virtually worthless in a very short period of time. The taxi plate he'd invested in, the car he'd invested in, they became practically worthless over a period of time. And he put basically a mortgage, the cost of a mortgage, into this. He'd borrowed money, he put his life into it. You know, so he'd invested heavily, his time, his energy, his money, and he was finding that the Minister of Transport, via the Taxi Regulator's Office, plus other private corporations, were profiting from his labour. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. And he was very unhappy with this, and you could tell he was stressed out about it because it was very difficult at the time, and it still is, to make a living, an honest living, or even a dishonest living, if you want to go down that route, from being a taxi driver. So he decided to become self-regulated so that he could charge what he felt was appropriate, and he wouldn't have to report to anybody or be answerable to anybody. So I didn't just interview him for that as well. I know he had done his research, and Rory had done an awful lot of research into this as well. So they'd found things out about the regulator's office. They'd found things out about the Minister of Transport. They'd done the research into the Minister of Transport, the company that was regulating the meters. And what we did was we interviewed him on the radio, and we named names. Okay. And we named the Minister of Transport. We named the taxi regulator officer, whoever her name, I can't remember, Kathleen Doyle I think her name was at the time, but I don't know if it's still the same one. Noel Dempsey was the Minister of Transport at the same time. And we talked openly about who Kathleen Doyle was, who she was related to, what her relationship is or was between Noel Dempsey. We talked about the corporation or the company that were involved in regulating the meters, and the fact that they were involved with the Bhutto family, Benazir Bhutto, and that same corporation or company had been involved in money laundering openly, and this is reported in the Times, and you know, the research had been done. So on the show we openly discussed this, and we didn't debate it, we discussed it, and we discussed their research. And prior to that we'd actually invited the taxi regulator and the Minister of Transport onto the show to rebut any of this information. And Dave offered to pick them up in his taxi if they wanted. But of course they never responded to him. He openly wrote to them, and he called them, and he left messages, and they never responded. So he went ahead with the show anyway.